They said the gold lay beneath the frozen earth, waiting to be scraped out by those who had already lost everything. Long before I arrived at the ruins of the old Kolyma camp, the wind had carried voices across these valleys, voices of prisoners whose names were erased from every archive, yet whose suffering lived on in the sand, in the ice, and in the riverbeds that once glittered with gold dust. I came here to uncover what remained of their story, but from the moment I stepped out onto the frost-bitten ground, I understood something instantly. This place was never meant to be remembered. The Kolyma region was the deadliest corner of the Gulag system, a land so cold that even the guards feared it. Temperatures dropped to -50 without warning. Snow could fall sideways, slicing across skin like a blade, but the prisoners who arrived here, exhausted, starving, trembling inside their thin uniforms, didn't come to survive. They came to mine. Gold, platinum, tin, anything the Soviet state demanded, and they worked until their hands turned black. Nobody understood what black meant until they saw it up close. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't coal. It was flesh that had frozen, thawed, refrozen, and died. Skin stiff as leather, nails cracked off at the base, fingers shrinking into twisted shapes. A prisoner in Kolyma could work a single winter and lose half his fingers without ever stepping near a doctor. And yet every morning the guards shouted the same order, "To the pits!" As I walked along the old mining trench, nothing but a gouge in the earth now, I imagined the sound that once echoed here. The metallic clank of shovels, the groaning of wooden carts, the coughs of men whose lungs were filled with dust and cold air sharp enough to cut them from the inside. Gold fever did not exist in Kolyma. Only gold terror. The Soviet Union needed gold to stabilize its economy. And Stalin found the perfect workforce: prisoners. Thousands of them were sentenced on charges like anti-Soviet speech, speculation, or simply because someone wrote their name on a list. Once they arrived in Kolyma, their identity was stripped away. They were no longer citizens. They were expendable labor. I followed the remnants of a rusted rail track used to transport ore. Each piece of metal was cracked and buckled, like it had been torn apart from within. The silence felt unnatural, thick, almost heavy. But the deeper I walked into the valley, the more I felt as if someone else was walking beside me, someone I couldn't see. Historical records describe men collapsing in the mines, their bodies frozen where they fell. The guards did not stop the others from working. They simply stepped around the corpses until the shift ended. Only then were the bodies thrown onto sleds and dragged back toward camp, stiff as planks. Many prisoners wrote secretly in diaries that the dead also worked because the dead cleared paths, the dead carried loads, and the dead reminded the living that winter was coming for them too. The barracks were not much better. Wooden walls that let the wind through, straw mattresses crawling with lice, a single stove for 50 men, always empty of firewood. At night, prisoners slept pressed against each other just to survive until morning. If one died in his sleep, the other stayed close to the body anyway. Heat was heat. But the most horrifying detail I uncovered was one that appeared repeatedly in survivor testimonies: the gold dust. When prisoners dug too quickly, clouds of microscopic gold particles floated into the air. Mixed with soil and chemical fumes, they clung to the skin, staining fingers and palms a dark metallic black. Some prisoners tried to rub it off. They scraped their hands against rocks. They washed them in frozen streams. Nothing helped. The gold had fused with the dead skin. And still, the guards shouted for them to dig faster. I knelt in the snow and brushed away a thin layer of ice. Beneath it, I found a splintered wooden beam, likely part of an old support structure for the mining shaft. It crumbled beneath my touch. Everything here was at the edge of disappearing, but the suffering it held seemed preserved, trapped like an insect in amber. A sudden gust of wind slammed through the valley. It felt colder than every gust before it. I stood, tightening my coat around my neck. The sky above me darkened, clouds rolling in fast as if the landscape itself wanted me gone. And for the first time since I arrived, I wondered whether the stories I had heard were warnings rather than accounts. Warnings meant to keep people like me from digging too deeply. Because as I turned toward the path that led back to camp, I noticed something the archives had never mentioned. Half buried near the snowbank, wedged between stones, was a small piece of metal, smooth, thin, curved, not a tool, not a nail. It was a shackle, and it was snapped clean in half. The prisoners here were never supposed to break free. So how did this happen? And what exactly did they try to escape from? I picked it up and the cold metal burned my palm. That was the moment I realized something else, something that chilled me more than the wind ever could. The broken shackle was not old. It looked disturbingly recent. I held the shackle in my hand longer than I should have. Its edges were too clean, too sharp. Metal left exposed in Kolyma's winters becomes brittle, pitted, almost eaten away by time. But this piece was smooth, barely weathered, and uncomfortably intact, aside from the fact that it had been torn apart. I turned it slowly between my fingers, studying the fracture line. It wasn't rusted, it wasn't worn. It looked as if it had given way under a single violent motion, like someone had ripped it open with impossible force. But that couldn't be right. Shackles like this were designed to restrain prisoners who were already starving, freezing, and exhausted. Even the strongest man wouldn't have been able to snap it, and no one had used these restraints in decades, or so the archives claimed. I slipped the shackle into my coat pocket. The metal was still burning cold, as if the earth hadn't wanted to release it, and as I walked farther along the path, the feeling that someone was watching me tightened around my shoulders like a noose. The old watchtower appeared next, a skeletal structure of rotting boards and crooked nails. It leaned to one side, threatening to collapse with each gust of wind. But in its prime, this tower had been the single most feared structure in the entire camp. Guards perched inside of it had the power of life and death over thousands of prisoners. A single rifle shot, a single accusation of laziness, a single misinterpreted gesture, that was all it took. I climbed the ladder carefully. Each rung creaked beneath my weight. Halfway up, a board snapped, sending a muted crack echoing through the valley. I froze, gripping the side rails with both hands. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Only when the wind resumed did I continue. Inside the watchtower, I found a rusted stove, a warped bench, and a small slit in the wall where a rifle barrel once rested. The view from up top stretched across the entire mining field. I imagined a guard standing where I stood, watching the prisoners below. Even at this height, I could almost hear the sounds, the scraping of shovels, the grunts of men trying to move frozen earth, the relentless bark of orders. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Carved into the wooden wall near the window, hidden behind a rotting beam, were letters. At first they were faint, almost invisible. But when I brushed away the dust, the message became clear. They are still here. Nothing else. No name, no date, no explanation. My heartbeat quickened. It could have been a prisoner's desperate message, scratched into the wood before his final shift. Or it could have been left years later by someone who discovered something the records had buried. But who? And what did they mean? Guards? Prisoners? Something else? Climbing down from the tower, I felt the weight of the message following me. The valley seemed narrower than before, the air heavier. As I stepped back onto the frozen ground, I heard a distant sound, a faint click, metal against metal. It came from one of the abandoned mine entrances. I walked slowly toward the sound, my boots crunching through the snow. The mine was little more than a black mouth carved into the hillside, framed by wooden beams that sagged from decades of neglect. A sign, half shattered by time, hung crookedly beside the entrance. The words were barely legible. Unauthorized entry prohibited. I shone my flashlight inside. The beam disappeared into overwhelming darkness. The air that drifted out smelled of earth and something else. Something metallic, stale, almost chemical. It was the scent described in so many memoirs, the smell of the mines where men worked until their bodies collapsed. I stepped inside. The light revealed scattered remnants of the past, a rusted shovel, a collapsed cart, a pile of frozen debris. But the deeper I walked, the more unnerving the silence became. Mines usually groan, they shift, they whisper with the weight of the earth pressing down, but this one was too still. Then I saw them. Boot prints, fresh ones. They weren't deep like those made in mud. They were faint impressions in a thin layer of powdery dust, left by someone who had walked here recently. very recently. They were human, unmistakably so, and they led deeper into the mine, far beyond where natural light could reach. I crouched down and touched one of the prints. The dust crumbled slightly between my fingers. Not frozen, not old. My breath fogged the air as I stood back up. Someone else was inside this mine. The thought tightened every muscle in my body. This wasn't just a place of history. Someone had been here, possibly still was. But why? There were no tourist routes, no research stations, no patrols. This mine had been officially sealed decades ago. I followed the prints slowly, each step pressing uneasily into the cold earth. The tunnel narrowed, forcing me to duck. My flashlight flickered against the walls, illuminating wooden beams cracked by frost. The air grew colder, sharper, almost painful to breathe. And then, without warning, the prints stopped. They didn't continue. They didn't turn back. They simply ended right in the middle of the tunnel, as if whoever had made them had vanished completely into the darkness. I raised my flashlight and scanned the tunnel walls, the ceiling, the floor. Nothing. No cracks big enough for a person to slip through, no side path, no collapsed shaft, just an abrupt end. My pulse hammered in my throat. Something very wrong had happened here. Then, from the darkness ahead, I heard it. A single, quiet exhale, not mine. Someone was breathing in the tunnel with me, and they were close. I froze where I stood, every muscle tightening at once. The sound had been unmistakable, soft, human, and impossibly close. In the silence of the mine, it echoed with a weight that didn't belong to the past. I held my breath and listened, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Nothing. No footsteps, no shuffling, no voice, just the oppressive emptiness of the tunnel pressing down from all sides. I slowly exhaled and took a step forward, forcing myself to remain calm. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, tracing across rough stone walls, etched with scars from decades of forced labor. My foot brushed against something metallic. I pointed the light downward, a spoon, bent almost in half. Prisoners frequently used spoons to scrape frozen earth when shovels were too heavy or too dull. Many died holding one. But this spoon, like the shackle I found outside, looked far too intact. The metal wasn't rusted. It wasn't discolored. It looked as if it had been dropped mere days ago. I knelt and picked it up. The handle was warm. That was impossible. Everything in these mines was frozen. Even my breath felt like it crystallized the moment it hit the air. But the spoon held heat, faint but undeniable, as if someone had been holding it moments earlier. A cold shiver raced down my spine. Something was not fitting the timeline. These mines hadn't been active for 70 years. No workers, no prisoners, no tools, and no breath but mine. Except I had heard a breath. The deeper I went, the narrower the tunnel became. The wooden support beams groaned under the weight of the earth above, some splintered like broken ribs. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment the darkness swallowed everything. When the light steadied, I caught sight of something carved into one of the beams, 3 vertical marks crossed by a fourth. A tally, then another, dozens of them carved at shoulder height. Prisoners kept track of days like this, marking time one cut at a time. But the problem was obvious. These marks were clean, fresh. The wood around them was pale and exposed, not darkened by age, as if someone had carved them recently. I reached out and touched the nearest line. The wood was smooth, almost polished. My fingertips tingled. I didn't know if it was the cold or fear. Behind me, something shifted. I spun around instantly, shining the flashlight back toward the entrance. Dust trickled from the ceiling, as if something or someone had touched a support beam. My breath grew shallow. It was easy to imagine the ghosts of starving prisoners wandering these tunnels, replaying their final hours. But I wasn't imagining sounds. This wasn't legend. Something physical had disturbed the mine. I took another step backward, keeping the light steady. My instincts screamed at me to retreat, but the footprints I had followed, those strange prints that simply vanished, pulled me deeper in. I turned back toward the path ahead. The tunnel sloped downward, steeper than before. The air became colder, so cold that the beam of the flashlight seemed to hang in a faint haze of frost. My boots slid slightly on the ground. The stones beneath my feet had been polished smooth, not by time, but by repetition. Thousands of footsteps over decades. Then the tunnel ended. Or rather, It opened. I stepped into a wide chamber, the largest space I had seen inside the mine, the ceiling domed above like the hollow of a massive skull. The walls glimmered faintly under my light, veins of quartz and gold dust embedded in the rock. This was the extraction chamber, the place where prisoners worked until their skin split open, where their hands turned black, and where the cold alone could kill them in minutes. In the center of the room lay a mound, not of rocks, of boots, a pile of tattered, rotting prisoner boots stacked haphazardly like someone had gathered them intentionally. Some were missing soles, others had holes where toes once pressed through, and scattered among them were bones, thin, fragile, yellowed fragments half buried in dust. I crouched down, the light trembling in my hand. My stomach twisted. This was not a burial site. This was something else, something closer to an inventory. Why would anyone gather the boots of the dead? Why would they arrange them like this? As I examined the pile, my eyes caught a shape protruding from beneath it. A rib cage, mostly intact. And around it, wrapped loosely like a belt, was something that made my blood run cold. A modern rope, synthetic, smooth, not the hemp ropes used in the 1930s and 40s. This was something you could buy in a hardware store today. I pulled it free carefully, studying it under the flashlight. It was almost new. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew this chamber existed, someone who moved through the mine without getting lost, someone who gathered the boots, someone who, breathing. There it was again. Close. I raised the flashlight slowly. At the far end of the chamber, partially hidden behind a column of rock, stood a shape. Tall, motionless, human. The light caught the edge of a coat, the outline of a shoulder. I opened my mouth to speak, but before a sound escaped, the figure stepped fully into view, and I saw what it was, what it used to be, what it could never be again. Because the face staring back at me wasn't the face of a man living in the present, it was the face of a prisoner, and it moved. For a moment, neither of us moved, me frozen in place with my flashlight trembling in my grip, and the figure standing at the edge of the chamber, half shadowed, half illuminated by the beam's pale glow. It wasn't possible. The Gulag closed decades ago. Every prisoner who had ever worked these tunnels was either freed or buried long ago. No one could still be here. And yet, the man before me looked exactly as survivors had described their comrades in the final weeks of winter. Skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones, lips cracked and bloodless, eyes like hollow pits, sunken yet glimmering with something, fear, exhaustion, or perhaps something far more unsettling. His uniform hung from his body like wet cloth. The stripes were faded but unmistakable, the fabric torn in places where the cold had eaten through. His boots were mismatched, one prisoner boot, one civilian shoe that looked far too small for him, and both his hands were black, not painted, not covered in dirt, but blackened, deadened, the skin stiff and cracked as if frostbite had consumed them long ago. The stories were true. The mines turned hands black, and this man wore the evidence like a mark of death. I felt every instinct in my body screaming to run, but my voice came out instead, quiet, shaking. "Are you alive?" The figure didn't speak. He blinked slowly, and the movement made something inside me twist. His chest rose slightly, barely perceptible beneath the hanging uniform. That meant breath. That meant life. But how? How could someone survive inside a sealed mine for decades? And why would he remain here, alone in total darkness? I took one cautious step forward. He flinched, not fear. Reflex, like a trapped animal who hadn't seen another human being in years. I raised my free hand slowly, showing I wasn't a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, my breath trembling. "I came to study this place, to understand what happened here." The man tilted his head slightly, as if trying to make sense of my words. His expression remained vacant, unreadable. Then he did something that rooted me to the spot in pure dread. He raised his hand. His blackened, frost-burned hand. The fingers were stiff, deadened, but they curled slowly, pointing deeper into the chamber, toward a narrow crevice I hadn't noticed before, barely wide enough for a grown man to squeeze through. "What's in there?" I asked. No answer. He only kept pointing. The beam of my flashlight quivered as I lifted it toward the direction he indicated. At the base of the rock column stood a small wooden crate, its lid removed and lying beside it. The wood was newer than anything else in the chamber, cleaner, smoother, as though it had been brought down recently. Inside the crate was a pile of objects that made my skin crawl: cloth, shoes, a flashlight, and several cans of food, all modern, all unexpired. Someone had been living down here, or someone had been keeping someone alive. The prisoner stepped closer, not toward me, toward the crate. He stopped beside it, lowering his head slightly. His shoulders shook once, twice. For a moment, I thought he was crying, but when he lifted his face again, I saw no tears, just emptiness. "Are you trapped here?" I whispered. His gaze shifted toward the crevice again. Not an answer, a warning. Cold wind suddenly rushed through the mine, though I hadn't felt a breeze since entering. The air pressure shifted, as if something massive had moved somewhere deeper inside. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. A faint rumble vibrated through the floor. The prisoner's head snapped toward the tunnel behind me, the way I had come. He inhaled sharply, and then I heard it too. Footsteps, slow, heavy, steady, not the rapid shuffle of someone lost or frightened, not the hesitant movement of someone exploring. These were purposeful, confident, the steps of someone who knew exactly where I was. "Is someone else here?" I whispered. The prisoner took 2 steps backward, merging into the shadow behind the rock column. His entire posture collapsed inward, as if he were trying to become invisible, terrified, small, whoever or whatever was coming. He feared them. I turned off my flashlight. Instantly, darkness swallowed everything. My eyes strained, but the chamber was pitch black. I pressed myself against the rock wall, heart hammering. The footsteps moved closer, slowly, deliberately, as if counting each step. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. They were almost at the chamber entrance. The prisoner made no sound. He didn't breathe. I didn't either. Then a faint glow appeared in the tunnel. Not a lantern, not a flashlight, a cigarette. The ember lit a sliver of the stranger's face, just enough for me to see the outline of a thick coat, a fur-lined collar, and a long scar running down from the cheek toward the jaw. A man, a guard? No. Impossible. Not after all these years. But he carried himself like one. The glowing tip of the cigarette brightened as he inhaled. Then, in a voice that echoed through the cavern with chilling neutrality, he said, "I know you're in here." My blood turned to ice. He wasn't talking to the prisoner. He was talking to me. And he knew exactly where I was standing. His voice echoed through the chamber, calm, steady, almost bored. The kind of tone a man uses when he's done this before, when hunting a stranger in a mine is nothing new to him. I pressed my back harder against the stone wall, forcing myself not to gasp. The ember of his cigarette glowed again as he took another long drag. "I know you followed the footprints," he continued, his tone almost conversational. "Most people don't see them. You must have good eyes." His boots scraped against the floor as he walked further into the chamber. Each step sounded heavy, deliberate. He wasn't afraid of the darkness. He wasn't feeling his way around. He knew every rock, every support beam, every drop shaft. This place belonged to him. I kept still. Dead still. Somewhere behind the rock pillar, the prisoner shifted soundlessly, curling deeper into the shadows. The fear radiating from him was almost palpable. Whoever this man was, the prisoner recognized him, and he was terrified. The stranger exhaled again. Smoke drifted through the chamber, faintly illuminated by the glow of the cigarette. Then he spoke more quietly, yet the words hit the air like a blade. "You shouldn't have come here." Silence followed, thick, suffocating. A beam of faint light swept across the chamber floor. He had switched on a small flashlight, holding it low, using it not to see but to track movement. He wasn't trying to illuminate the room. He was watching shadows, watching for shifts, looking for the outline of a human body hiding against stone. He moved the beam slowly along the ground. It crept across the boots piled in the center, across the bones, across the crate I had inspected only moments earlier. When it reached the crevice where the prisoner hid, the man paused. The prisoner did not move. He pressed himself into complete stillness, as if freezing his body would make him invisible. Somehow, the light passed over. Him without detection. Or maybe the stranger already knew he was there and didn't care. Maybe he only cared about me. The beam moved again, toward my direction. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed myself flatter against the wall, trying to become another part of the rock. The light inched closer, closer, stopping just before it would have brushed across my boots. Then, unexpectedly, the man stopped. He lifted the cigarette again, inhaled deeply, and spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first one to wander in here thinking this place is abandoned. People love their ghost stories, but they don't understand." He paused, exhaling slowly. "This mine never closed." The mine never closed. The words hit me like a physical blow. I knew the official records. Kolyma's mines were shut down after Stalin's death, the Gulag dismantled, prisoners released or relocated, but this man spoke with absolute certainty, as if he knew something I didn't. He took another step toward me. "Come out," he said, almost gently. "It's easier that way." I remained silent. Something shifted behind him, so subtle it might have been my imagination. His head snapped toward the noise. The cigarette ember brightened, revealing the tense set of his jaw. Then he said something unexpected. "You're not alone." My blood froze. He wasn't talking about the prisoner. He was talking about something else, something deeper in the mine. The prisoner, still hidden, lifted his head slightly, eyes widening. He looked toward the crevice, the same narrow passage he had pointed to earlier. Whatever was inside that crevice, the guard feared it too. The stranger stepped backward, positioning himself near the tunnel where he had entered. He flicked ash onto the floor. His voice grew harsher, stripped of the calm authority it held before. "You shouldn't wake them." "Them?" Before I could process the word, a faint sound drifted from the crevice, soft, rhythmic, like the quiet dragging of something across stone. The stranger's eyes locked on the darkness at the far end of the chamber. "No," he whispered, "not now." His composure cracked. Suddenly he stamped out the cigarette, grabbed the small flashlight tighter, and hissed toward the prisoner. "Hide, now." The prisoner obeyed instantly, pressing deeper into the shadows. The scraping noise grew louder, more deliberate, more coordinated. It was coming closer. A chill slid down my spine. The stories I'd read, rumors, really, spoke of prisoners sealed alive in collapsed tunnels, forgotten by guards, left to die in darkness. Some said they lasted days, some said weeks, some said, no, that was superstition, folklore woven from suffering. It couldn't be real. But the sound was real. The stranger backed toward the exit tunnel. Then he turned toward me, straight toward where I hid, and his voice cut through the chamber like a knife. "If you want to live," he said, "don't make a sound. Whatever you hear next, don't answer it." Before I could move, before I could breathe, before I could even think, a voice drifted out of the crevice, a voice that did not belong in a place where no one alive should be. A voice calling softly, in Russian, "Help me." The voice echoed through the chamber with a softness that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a scream. It was a plea, whispered, trembling, fragile, the kind of plea a dying man might make in his final hour. But no living man should have been able to speak from that crevice. No one. The stranger, the one who had entered with the cigarette, stopped dead in his tracks. His entire posture went rigid, as if his body were refusing to acknowledge what his ears had already heard. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Not again." Behind the rock pillar, the prisoner curled into himself like a wounded animal, shaking violently. His blackened hands pressed against his ears. He did not look toward the crevice. He didn't dare. The voice came again. "Please, someone, help me." This time it was louder, clearer, almost desperate. I felt every instinct pulling me forward, toward the sound of a man in need, a man trapped, a man suffering. But the stranger's warning rang in my mind. "Whatever you hear next, don't answer it." My fingers twitched, my throat tightened. The words, "Are you all right?" hovered at the edge of my lips, begging to escape. But before I could speak, the stranger turned sharply toward the crevice and shouted, "Silence!" His voice thundered through the chamber with a desperation that shattered his earlier calm. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The scrap of sound from the crevice stopped immediately, as if obeying him. He took a step backward, then another. His voice was low, tense. "We need to leave this chamber, now." I stayed rooted, flashlight still off, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "What's in there?" I whispered. The stranger shook his head. "Not what? Who?" The prisoner whimpered softly, the sound echoing in the darkness. The stranger raised his flashlight just enough to cast a thin line of light across the chamber floor, but not high enough to reveal my position. He wasn't trying to find me anymore. He was trying to find them. The chamber felt suddenly colder, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in seconds. My breath fogged thickly, collecting in the air like a hovering cloud. Then the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a whisper. Closer. "I hear you." My body went rigid. The sound hadn't come from the crevice. It had come from just behind the boots in the center of the room. The prisoner let out a strangled cry and covered his mouth to stop himself. The stranger spun toward the boots, flashlight shaking. He pointed the beam straight at the pile. Nothing, just torn, leather and scattered bones. Then a sound came from beneath the boots, a faint shifting, as if something buried under the mound had stirred. "No," the stranger breathed, almost to himself. "It's too early. They shouldn't be active." I stared at him in disbelief. He was talking like someone who had been living here for years, someone who understood the mind's secrets intimately. And the way he said, "they," chilled me more than the cold air. He wasn't warning us about ghosts. He was warning us about people who should not be alive. The pile of boots shifted again, this time clearly. A shoe slid down the side of the mound, thudding softly against the stone floor. The stranger lifted his weapon, an old Soviet pistol I hadn't noticed before, and aimed it directly at the mound. "Stay where you are," he commanded, voice shaking. The boots stopped moving. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stepped away from the wall, slowly, carefully. "What is happening here?" I whispered. The stranger didn't answer. He kept his gun trained on the mound as he backed toward the tunnel. "We need to go, now, both of you." He meant me and the prisoner. Another shift came from the pile, this time louder, more forceful. The stranger's voice cracked. "Move!" The prisoner darted out from behind the rock pillar, stumbling on weak legs, blackened hands outstretched for balance. For a moment, the beam of the flashlight caught his face, sunken, hollow, terrified. I rushed toward the tunnel entrance, my footsteps silent on the frozen earth. The stranger didn't take his eyes off the mound, waving us through. "Keep going, don't stop." We reached the mouth of the tunnel, the darkness behind us like a living thing. Then, a hand emerged from the pile of boots, blackened, frozen, skeletal, and it grabbed the floor, pulling something upward from beneath. The prisoner screamed. The stranger fired a shot, the gunshot exploding inside the chamber like a bomb. The hand recoiled slightly, then lunged again, scraping against stone. I turned and ran deeper into the tunnel, my flashlight trembling in my grip as the stranger's voice echoed after me. "Don't look back." But I did. I saw the boots scattering as someone, pulled itself fully out of the mound, a prisoner. But not like the one who had helped me. This one had no eyes, only black hollow sockets, and its mouth moved, slowly, whispering. I tore myself away and sprinted into the darkness as the stranger shouted one last command, one that echoed in my skull long after we fled the chamber. "Don't let them touch you." The tunnel swallowed us whole as we fled, me in front, the prisoner staggering behind, and the stranger last, turning every few steps to watch the darkness behind us. The only light came from my trembling flashlight, bouncing off the walls in frantic, uneven strokes. Each breath scraped my throat like ice. The cold deepened, tightening around my lungs until every inhale felt like punishment. Behind us, from the chamber we had just escaped, came the sound of movement, slow at first, then growing more frantic. Something was dragging itself forward, something that should not have been able to move at all. "Faster!" the stranger hissed. The prisoner groaned, his knees nearly buckling under him. His blackened fingers scraped the wall for balance. His breathing was ragged and uneven, the breath of a man who had lived on starvation for years. I grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, surprised by how light he was, less like lifting a man and more like hauling a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. The tunnel sloped upward, the air thinned further. And then the sound came again. A voice, the same voice that had whispered from the crevice, but now it was closer. "I see you." The prisoner let out a broken cry and fell forward onto his hands. The stranger grabbed him by the collar and yanked him upright. "Move!" he barked. "They're faster than they look." Faster. I didn't dare turn around to find out, but the scraping behind us confirmed it. The dragging had become a rapid shuffle, something gaining speed on all fours. We reached a fork in the tunnel, a place where two paths branched off into darkness. I stopped. "Which way?" The stranger didn't hesitate. "Left. Right collapses after 20 meters. My heart slammed against my ribs. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer. His boots were already pounding down the left-hand tunnel. The prisoner stumbled beside me, trembling violently. I followed the stranger, pulling the prisoner along, our footsteps echoing like frantic drumbeats. Behind us, the sound grew louder. Closer. A whisper drifted down the passageway. "Come back." I nearly tripped. There was something in the voice. Something wrong. Something layered. It didn't sound like one person anymore. It sounded like many, dozens, whispering in unison, all repeating the same desperate plea. "Come back," the stranger shouted over his shoulder. "Don't listen to them!" I forced my legs to move faster, my body screaming for oxygen. The prisoner stumbled again. I caught him under the arm. His eyes rolled with terror. And then the tunnel widened. We burst into a larger passageway reinforced with thick wooden beams. The stranger finally stopped, breathing hard, and grabbed a rusted chain hanging from the ceiling. He yanked it once. A metal gate slid halfway down from the ceiling with a shriek. "Help me drop it!" he ordered. I grabbed the chain with him. The prisoner dropped to his knees, shaking too violently to help. Together, the stranger and I pulled. The gate rumbled downward, grinding against ice and debris. The voices behind us grew louder. "Come back!" "Yes. Come." "We're so cold." My hand slipped on the chain. The stranger gritted his teeth and pulled harder. The gate dropped another foot. Something scraped the floor at the far end of the tunnel. Fast, sharp, deliberate. My flashlight beam flickered across the corridor, and I froze. A pale hand curled around the corner. Then, a second. Then, two more. Something was pulling itself into view. "Pull!" the stranger roared. We yanked again, and the gate slammed the final distance, striking the ground with a metallic crash that shook the passage. Silence. We stood there, panting, listening. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears. The prisoner curled into himself on the ground, rocking slightly. Then, a hand slammed against the bars. I stumbled back, breath escaping in a gasp. The fingers were blackened, frozen, twisted into claw-like shapes. They curled around the metal bars, straining. Then, another hand gripped the bars, and another, 3 sets of hands, all pressing forward, all trying to force the gate open. The stranger stepped between us and the gate, raising his pistol. "Back away!" he shouted at the figures behind the bars. "Back away, or I swear!" He didn't finish, because one of the faces pressed itself between the bars. It was the eyeless prisoner, the one who had pulled himself from beneath the boots. His skin was gray-blue, stretched thin over a skull that seemed too narrow, too long. Frost clung to his cheeks like white mold. When he opened his mouth, a puff of frozen air escaped, and he whispered, "You left us." The prisoner beside me whimpered, curling into a ball. The stranger gritted his teeth, raised the gun, and fired 3 times through the bars. The shots echoed violently through the tunnel. The figure staggered back, collapsing to the ground. The other hands retreated into the darkness. Silence returned. Only then did the stranger lower his gun. His face, partially illuminated by my trembling flashlight, showed something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not fear, but guilt. He turned to me slowly. His voice was quiet. "They weren't supposed to wake," he said. "Not yet." My throat tightened. "What are they?" He stared at the gate, jaw clenched. For a moment he didn't answer. Then he turned toward me and spoke words that made my entire body go cold. "They're the ones who never left the mine. The ones the guards sealed inside when the tunnels collapsed. They didn't die the way the records claim." "How is that possible?" I whispered. He shook his head. "You won't believe me." I swallowed hard. "Try me." He took a breath, cold, shaky, and said, "They survived, but they're not alive." Before I could respond, before I could ask anything, a new sound echoed from behind the gate, a voice, weak, childlike, and speaking perfect Russian. "Are you Coming back? The voice was softer than the others, softer, higher, carrying a tone that pierced through the cold air like a splinter. Of ice, a child, or something imitating one. The words floated through the bars of the gate with unnatural clarity. Are you coming back? The prisoner on the floor shoved his face into his arms, rocking harder. The stranger stiffened, his pistol trembling in his grip. Even he, who had spoken with disturbingly intimate knowledge of this mine, seemed utterly shaken by that voice. I whispered, "Who was that?" He swallowed once, eyes fixed on the darkness behind the bars. Not who, what's left. The voice repeated itself, a little louder this time. Are you coming back? My breath formed a cloud in front of me, trembling with each exhale, and then, slowly, deliberately, a tiny hand gripped the bars. Smaller than the others, too small. Cold dread punched through my chest. I thought they didn't use children here, I whispered. They didn't, the stranger said grimly. Not officially, but families were deported together, entire groups accused of sabotage. Men, women, children. Kolyma didn't differentiate. My stomach turned. The small hand curled tighter around the bars. The skin was blue-gray, covered in frost. The fingers were too thin, the joints bulging like pebbles under stretched skin. And attached to that hand was a faint, weak breathing. Help me. The stranger pointed his gun at the hand, hesitated, lowered it. He couldn't shoot. Even he had a line he wouldn't cross. Don't answer it, he whispered to me without looking away. If you respond, it will keep speaking, and if it keeps speaking, the others will wake. I clamped my mouth shut and stepped backward, the prisoner crawling behind me like a frightened shadow. The stranger finally tore himself away from the gate. We need to move, he said, before they find another way around. I froze. Another way? You mean there's more than one tunnel that leads to this one? He didn't answer directly. This mine was built in chaos. Tunnels intersect in ways no map ever recorded. If something wants to reach you, it can. A surge of panic jolted through me. Then where do we go? He pointed deeper into the tunnel network. There's an emergency shaft further down. It leads to an old ventilation corridor. If it hasn't collapsed, we can reach the main exit. If it hasn't collapsed, I repeated, that's the best option you're getting. The prisoner whimpered as we started moving again, shuffling weakly beside me. I supported him with one arm, my other hand gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The stranger walked ahead, gun raised, shoulders tense. As we advanced, the air grew colder. Not gradually, violently. A temperature drop that felt unnatural. My lungs burned. Frost began forming on the metal parts of the flashlight. The stranger paused. This isn't right, he whispered. The cold is coming too fast. A rumbling shook. The ground beneath us, soft at first, then more distinct. Something was moving through the walls, not behind us, beside us, parallel to the tunnel, following our path. The prisoner made a soft, broken sound. The stranger motioned frantically for silence, and we pressed ourselves against the wall. I switched off my flashlight. Darkness swallowed us whole. The rumbling grew louder, closer. Dust fell from the ceiling. The stones around us vibrated. Something massive pressed against the other side of the tunnel wall, as if testing it, as if feeling for weaknesses. Then came a whisper, not from behind the gate, not from ahead, but from directly behind the stone wall we were leaning against. I hear you, the prisoner sobbed, burying his face against my arm. The stranger grabbed him by the mouth, muffling the sound. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. Something scraped the stone, slowly, painfully slowly, as if fingers, black and frozen, were tracing the outline of the wall from the other side. I felt the vibration through my spine. A hollow tapping echoed next. 1, 2, 3. Rhythmic, deliberate, intelligent. Tap, tap, tap. They're mapping us, the stranger breathed. A chill ran through me. Mapping? Learning where we are. I felt my stomach drop. We need to run. The stranger didn't argue. He flicked his flashlight back on and began moving at a near sprint down the tunnel. I helped the prisoner move as fast as his weak legs allowed. The tapping continued behind us, getting faster, more frantic. Tap, 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 and then a crack splintered through the wall. I gasped as a line ripped across the stone, thin at first, then widening. Dust exploded outward. "They're breaking through!" the stranger shouted. He grabbed my shoulder and yanked me forward, forcing me to run faster. The prisoner stumbled, but kept pace with sheer terror pushing him onward. We rounded a corner, the tunnel curving sharply. Behind us, another crack, then another. Stone gave way with a booming crack. A scream, inhuman, filled the corridor. The stranger shoved us ahead. "The emergency shaft is close. It has to be close." We sprinted, lungs burning, legs shaking. The prisoner's breath rattled like broken glass. My flashlight flickered wildly. The tunnel walls seemed to close in around us. Then, suddenly, the stranger stopped. Dead end. The tunnel had collapsed long ago, filled with rocks and ice. "No," the stranger whispered. "No, no, no. This wasn't supposed to be blocked." I turned back. In the darkness behind us, pale shapes began pulling themselves through the broken wall. Slow, silent, too many, far too many. My flashlight beam landed on the closest one, a prisoner's face, hollow, black-eyed and smiling. The stranger raised his pistol. The prisoner beside me whispered one word. "Run." But there was nowhere left to run. There is a moment, one terrifying, suspended moment, when the world seems to narrow into a single point, a point where escape is no longer a direction, but a memory. That moment struck me now, standing at the dead end of a collapsed tunnel as the pale figures dragged themselves through the breach behind us. Their movements were wrong. Not jerky like the starved prisoners I'd read about in memoirs, not stiff like bodies frozen by the Kolyma cold. These creatures moved with purpose, slow, yes, but deliberate, as if every motion had been rehearsed thousands of times in darkness. The stranger fired again. The blast tore through the tunnel, echoing off the stone, but the nearest figure barely flinched. The bullet struck its shoulder, blowing away a chunk of decayed flesh. It kept moving. "They don't stop," the stranger said, voice breaking for the first time. "They never stop." I backed toward the pile of collapsed stone. The prisoner beside me pressed against it, shaking uncontrollably, whispering something over and over in Russian, pleas to a god who hadn't answered in 70 years. My flashlight beam landed on the creature closest to us. The skin on its face was torn, revealing pale bone beneath, yet its mouth stretched slowly into something like a smile, thin, brittle, unnatural. A smile that didn't reach its empty sockets. The stranger grabbed my arm. "We climb." "What?" "We climb," he repeated, already hauling himself up onto the collapsed stones. The pile wasn't high, but it was steep, jagged, and unstable. Ice coated everything. The prisoner stared up at it with hopeless eyes. "He can't climb that," I said. "He can," the stranger snapped, "or he dies. Move." I shoved the flashlight into my pocket and pulled the prisoner upward. His blackened hands slipped on the rock, leaving flakes of dead skin behind. His breathing became ragged, desperate, but fear gave him strength, an unnatural burst that pushed him upward. The stranger reached down, grabbed the prisoner by his torn uniform, and dragged him another meter. I scrambled after them, loose stones tumbling beneath my boots. Behind us, the creatures reached the base of the rock pile. The scraping of their fingers against stone was the worst sound I'd ever heard, like nails screeching across glass, multiplied by dozens. They began climbing too, slowly at first, then faster, much faster. "They're adapting," the stranger whispered. He turned, aimed, fired. A bullet slammed into one creature's chest, knocking it backward. It fell, limbs twisting unnaturally as it tumbled. Before it even hit the ground, two more were climbing past it. The prisoner gasped as he slipped again. I grabbed his arm, heaved him upward. We reached a narrow gap in the ceiling, a ventilation shaft partially exposed by the collapse. It was barely big enough for a child. No adult should have been able to fit through it. But the stranger shoved his pack off and thrust, himself inside the opening. "Push him up," he barked, pointing at the prisoner. I lifted with everything I had. The stranger grabbed the prisoner's wrists and yanked him into the shaft. The prisoner disappeared into the darkness above. I scrambled toward the opening next, stones sliding away under my hands. The creatures were halfway up the pile now. One reached out toward my foot. Its fingers brushed my boot. The cold that shot through me was unnatural, like the cold of the frozen Kolyma night concentrated into a single icy sting. I kicked frantically, knocking the hand away, and hurled myself upward. The stranger grabbed my forearm and hauled me into the shaft. My chest scraped the edges. Rocks tore at my coat. I felt the stone bite into my ribs as I squeezed through. The stranger pulled harder. Then a hand grabbed my ankle. Not the stranger's. It was blackened, frozen, thin as a branch. The grip tightened, cold needles shooting up my leg. I cried out, kicking wildly. My boot slammed against bone. Something cracked. The hand fell away. The stranger wrenched me fully into the shaft, and we both tumbled backward, sliding down a narrow, sloping tunnel of ice and stone. The world spun. My breath tore from my lungs. The cold scraped my skin as we slid deeper, faster. The shaft bent sharply. We fell, not far, maybe a few meters, but we hit the ground hard. My flashlight flickered out of my pocket, spinning across the floor. The beam steadied, illuminating a tight corridor barely a meter high. The prisoner was crouched there, shaking violently. "We're not safe," he whispered. "They know this place. They know all tunnels." The stranger pressed a hand against the shaft above us, listening. The creatures were already there. We heard them scraping at the rock, testing the opening, whispering. "Yes, come back. Don't leave us. Stay." The prisoner covered his ears and sobbed. The stranger looked at me, eyes hollow. "We go forward," he said. "There's only one path." I looked down the tiny corridor illuminated by the dim flashlight. It was a freezing crawl space, carved decades ago for ventilation, not for escape. The air was stale, thin, and far too cold. But behind us, the voices grew louder, closer. We dropped to our hands and knees and began crawling. The passage narrowed further. The walls pressed against my shoulders. Ice cut into my palms. My breath came in sharp bursts, fogging thickly in front of me. Behind us, a sound, a scraping, a hand reaching into the shaft. They were coming. We crawled faster. Stones tore skin from my knuckles. My heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. Then, my hand pressed against empty space. The tunnel dropped off. I froze. The stranger's voice echoed from ahead, tight and panicked. "Don't stop! Jump! Now!" I looked down into darkness, and then I heard something moving in that darkness. Something breathing, waiting. The darkness below me felt alive. Not empty, not silent. Alive. A hollow, echoing breath rose from beneath the ledge, drifting up the tunnel like a warning. My flashlight beam trembled across the drop, revealing nothing but a void. The prisoner behind me whimpered, his trembling hand gripping the back of my coat. "Jump!" the stranger called again from the darkness ahead, his voice breaking for the first time. "There's no other way!" Behind us, the ventilation shaft cracked, stone crumbled. A frozen hand broke through the opening, reaching blindly for us, then another, and another. Their whispers bled into the tunnel. "Don't leave! We're cold! Help! Us!" the prisoner screamed. Something inside me snapped into place, not courage, not logic, but pure instinct. I sucked in a freezing breath, tightened my grip on the flashlight, and pushed off the ledge. The fall was brief, but hard. My shoulder slammed into icy rock, and the impact shot pain through my chest. The tunnel floor tilted downward into a steep slope, and I began sliding uncontrollably. The flashlight spun from my hands, bouncing ahead like a wild, flickering star. I clawed at the walls, but the ice was too smooth. The prisoner and the stranger slid after me, their screams mixed with mine. The tunnel swallowed us whole. Then, suddenly, light. Not daylight, torchlight. We burst out of the chute, slamming onto solid ground. My ribs screamed, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The flashlight skittered across the floor and came to rest against something wooden. I looked up. We were inside an old service corridor, timber supports, rusted rails, and abandoned mining equipment scattered across the ground. The air was stale but warmer than the ventilation shaft. Above us, the opening we'd fallen through was a small black circle, too small for the creatures to climb through. For now. The stranger got to his feet, limping. The prisoner lay on the ground, gasping, his blackened fingers curling and uncurling in panic. "We have to move," the stranger said breathlessly. "They'll find another path." I coughed, tasting dust and blood. "How do you know this place? How do you know every turn, every tunnel?" He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he knelt beside a rusted metal locker embedded in the wall. He forced the door open and pulled out something I never expected, an old Soviet officer's coat. Faded, but intact. The prisoner recoiled in fear the moment he saw it. I understood why. The patches, the insignia, the rank. The stranger wasn't a prisoner. He had been a guard. "Years ago," he said quietly, avoiding my eyes. "When the camp was collapsing, some of us stayed behind. Not because we wanted to, because someone had to seal the tunnels. Someone had to make sure none of them got out." My skin crawled. "You sealed them in alive?" His voice cracked. "We thought they were dead. We thought everyone inside was dead. The mines collapsed. We sealed the shafts. The orders said to leave them, so we left. But they didn't die." He shook his head slowly. "Not the way they should have. Something about these tunnels kept them together. The cold, the starvation, the chemicals in the ore, the darkness. I don't know. I've never known." The prisoner on the ground whispered through trembling lips. "You left us." The guard turned toward him, guilt carved deep into his face. "I stayed," he whispered back. "I never left this mine after that day. Someone had to keep them contained. Someone had to make sure no one reopened the wrong tunnels." My throat tightened. "So the fresh footprints—" "Mine," he said, "but not all of them." A chill crawled down my spine. "What do you mean?" He stepped past us, lifting his pistol, and pointed it down the corridor. "Listen." The corridor ahead was silent. Too silent. Then, faintly, we heard something. Low, steady breathing. Not behind us, not above us, ahead of us. Something was waiting in the dark. The stranger lowered the pistol slightly. "There's another exit," he said. "But we have to pass through the old infirmary chamber. They gather there sometimes. It's warmer. More familiar." The prisoner whimpered. I swallowed hard. "And if they're there, we don't stop." He moved forward, one slow step at a time. The prisoner clung to my arm as we followed. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting and descending. My flashlight beam cut through the stale air, illuminating rusted tools, bent rails, and piles of frozen debris. Then we heard it. Multiple breaths. Dozens. Soft, raspy, uneven. The guard froze. His shoulders tightened. "They're ahead." My pulse hammered so hard it hurt. The prisoner pressed his blackened hands to his ears, whispering prayers under his breath. The stranger raised his pistol again. "Stay behind me." We stepped into a wider room. My flashlight beam swept across broken beds, rusted medical trays, torn bandages, frozen stiff as wood. But the beds weren't empty. Figures lay on them. Dozens. Still. Silent. Not moving. Dead? No. Waiting. One of them turned its head toward us. The stranger whispered, "Keep walking." My legs felt like ice. Each step was agony. The creatures watched us, hollow eyes following every movement. They didn't rise. They didn't reach out. Not until we reached the far door. Then, all of them inhaled at once. A single unified breath. A sound I will never forget. The stranger shouted, "Run!" We bolted through the door, slamming it behind us. The walls shook, hands clawed from the other side. Wood splintered. "Move!" he screamed. We sprinted down the final corridor, the air growing warmer, the wind stronger. And then, light. Daylight. We burst out of the mine entrance and collapsed. Into the snow, gasping, sobbing, shaking. The cold air sliced at my lungs, but it was clean. Real. Alive. The mine behind us groaned. The stranger dropped to his knees. "It won't hold much longer," he whispered. "I can't keep them in anymore." The prisoner crawled away, staring at the open world with tears in his eyes. I turned to the stranger. "What now?" He looked back at the dark mouth of the mine. "They'll come out," he said, "and when they do, someone will have to seal it again, someone stronger, someone who can warn the world." He stared straight at me. "You're going to tell this story." The ground trembled beneath us, and from deep inside the mine, they whispered my name.